After killing a black woman during a traffic stop, a guilt-ridden racist cop, Ryan Pierce, spirals into depression and hallucinations. That same night, he dies in a car crash under mysterious circumstances. Was it an accident or something more? The town questions whether justice or fate intervened. Let's find out. Officer Ryan Pierce sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, watching the dark stretch of road ahead. It was a quiet night. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that left him alone with his thoughts, something he had grown to resent. He had worked in Greenfield, Wisconsin, for nearly a decade, but nights like these always made the town feel more suffocating than serene. Ryan's radio crackled with faint static, and his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't mind routine calls, the ones where he could pull over some speeding teenager or a drunk driver. Those were easy. But something about the stillness tonight unsettled him. His mind wandered to the things he tried to avoid thinking about: his growing frustration with the town, his failing marriage, the feeling that his life was spiraling in a direction he couldn't control. Suddenly, headlights appeared in his rear-view mirror. A car was approaching fast, too fast for this quiet road. Ryan's instincts kicked in. He flipped on his lights and pulled out behind the car, a black sedan with out-of-state plates. The car slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, and Ryan felt that familiar surge of adrenaline. This was what he was good at, controlling the situation. He parked his cruiser behind the car and stepped out, approaching the driver's side. His hand instinctively rested on the holster of his gun, a habit that had become second nature. As he reached the window, the driver rolled it down, a young black woman, alone, her eyes wide with nervousness. "License and registration," Ryan said coldly, his eyes sweeping over her as he tried to size her up. The woman fumbled in her purse. I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize I was speeding. I was just trying to get home." "Where you coming from?" Ryan interrupted, his voice sharper than it needed to be. She hesitated for a moment, and Ryan felt a flicker of suspicion. "I was visiting my mother," she finally said, handing over her documents. Ryan took the license and registration without looking at them. His gaze lingered on the woman's trembling hands. "You got something to hide?" he asked, the question more accusatory than inquisitive. "No, officer, I." "Step out of the vehicle." The woman's eyes widened in fear. "Why? What did I do?" Ryan's temper flared. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he was already predisposed to distrust. "Step out of the car." "Now." She hesitated, and Ryan's hand moved to his gun, fingers grazing the grip. "I'm not going to ask again." The woman slowly opened the door and stepped out. Ryan's eyes flicked to her car. There was nothing suspicious, but that didn't matter. He needed to be in control. He gestured for her to stand by the hood of the car, and she complied, her hands shaking as she stood in the cold night air. "Put your hands on the hood," Ryan ordered. "I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, panic rising in her voice. "Please, I just want to go home." Ryan's patience snapped. He grabbed her arm, forcefully spinning her around and pressing her against the car. She struggled, but he tightened his grip, pulling her arms behind her back. "Stop resisting," he shouted, his voice louder than the situation warranted. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with him. "I'm not resisting. Please, just let me go." But her voice barely registered. All Ryan could feel was the surge of power in his veins, the control he craved. The situation spiraled faster than he could grasp. In a blur of motion, the woman twisted slightly, trying to turn her face toward him, and in that moment, he made the fatal decision. His hand instinctively went to his gun. In the span of a heartbeat, the deafening sound of a gunshot echoed through the empty road. The woman's body jerked, and she collapsed to the ground, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Ryan stood frozen, the weight of what he had done settling in. For a moment, everything was still. He stared at the woman lying motionless on the pavement, her blood pooling beneath her. It was over in an instant, but the consequences of that single moment stretched before him like a chasm he could never cross. His breath came in shallow gasps. He holstered his weapon with trembling hands, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He had control. He had control. But now, there was nothing but the cold, lifeless body of a woman he didn't even know, and the crushing realization that he had made a mistake, one that could never be undone. Ryan sat in the dim light of his living room, staring at his hands. His mind replayed the night over and over again, as if searching for a moment when things could have gone differently. He had filed the report, said that Ava Thompson had been acting aggressively, that she had resisted arrest and reached for something in her car. It wasn't entirely a lie, he told himself. But it wasn't the truth either. His wife, Melissa, had already gone to bed, their relationship long having cooled into an unspoken distance. He couldn't bring himself to talk to her about what had happened, knowing she wouldn't understand. Or worse, she would ask questions that he didn't have answers for. The silence in the house felt oppressive, the ticking of the clock louder than usual. Ryan's chest tightened. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table and poured himself a drink, hoping it would dull the edge of his thoughts. But no amount of alcohol could drown out the image of Ava's face as she fell to the ground. Her wide, terrified eyes haunted him, following him into every corner of his mind. The TV flickered in the background, a muted news anchor discussing local headlines. Ryan tried to focus on anything but the thoughts swirling in his head. But the more he tried to push it away, the more the guilt settled in, sinking deep into his bones. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Sergeant Davis. The investigation is routine. You'll be fine. Keep your head down for a while. Routine. Fine. The words felt hollow, meaningless. There was nothing routine about what had happened. He had taken a life. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Ryan stood abruptly, the sudden motion making his head spin. He needed air. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The street was quiet, the houses dark. It was late, and the world was asleep, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He walked down the street aimlessly, his mind replaying the events of the night like a broken record. He told himself it was justified. Ava had resisted, she had been a threat. But the truth gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. He knew, deep down, that he had overreacted. He had let his anger, his prejudice, cloud his judgment. And now a woman was dead because of it. As he turned the corner, he found himself in front of the local church, its steeple towering over the small town. The church had always been a place of solace for him, a reminder of the moral compass he once believed he followed. But now, standing there, he felt like an intruder. The weight of his guilt was too much to bear, and he knew that no amount of prayer or penance could absolve him of what he had done. Ryan looked up at the church's cross, illuminated against the dark sky. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The silence around him felt like an answer, cold and unforgiving. As he turned to walk back home, a shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. He stopped, his heart pounding. For a brief moment, he thought he saw Ava standing at the end of the street, her eyes fixed on him. But when he blinked, she was gone, the street empty once again. The hallucinations were starting. Ryan had heard about cops who couldn't live with their guilt, the way their minds turned against them. But he wasn't like that. He wasn't one of the weak ones, he told himself. He just needed to get through this, to move on. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be possible. The morning after the incident, Ryan arrived at the station early, hoping that burying himself in work would drown out the growing unease gnawing at him. The station was quiet, the hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of feet the only sounds. He walked in with his usual brisk pace, forcing a neutral expression as he passed by the front desk. Inside, he could feel the weight of everyone's gazes. His colleagues knew about the shooting. News like that traveled fast. Officer Matthews, a younger cop who had always looked up to Ryan, gave him a tight nod. The others, too, acknowledged him with subtle gestures, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. Ryan sat at his desk and stared at the stack of paperwork in front of him, the official report from last night sitting right on top. He had rewritten it twice, trying to make sure the details held up under scrutiny. The story was simple. Ava Thompson had acted erratically, resisted arrest, and he'd had no choice but to defend himself. But no matter how much he edited and adjusted, it felt like a lie wrapped in layers of justification. Across the room, he heard whispers, low murmurs from a group of officers who were eyeing him from the break room. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but he didn't need to. They were talking about him. About the shooting. About Ava. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was beginning to unravel. Everything that had once seemed so clear, his sense of duty, his view of the world, was now murky, tainted by the memory of Ava's wide, terrified eyes. The door to the captain's office opened, and Captain Reynolds stepped out, his eyes briefly scanning the room before landing on Ryan. The older man's face was a mask of professional calm, but Ryan could sense the underlying tension. Captain Reynolds had been the one to sign off on Ryan's report, rubber-stamping it like any other case. But even he had to know that this wasn't like the others. "Pierce," Reynolds called out, his tone firm. "My office." Ryan stood, feeling the eyes of the station follow him as he made his way across the room. He stepped inside the captain's office, the door clicking shut behind him. Reynolds gestured for him to sit, and Ryan lowered himself into the chair across from the desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken words. "We're going to have to conduct an internal investigation," Reynolds finally said, his voice measured. "Standard procedure after a shooting." Ryan nodded, though his stomach churned. He had expected this. It was routine. "I understand." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying Ryan's face. "Is there anything I should know before the investigation begins?" The question hung in the air, and for a fleeting second, Ryan considered telling the truth, confessing that he had lost control, that Ava hadn't been a threat, that his own biases had clouded his judgment. But the fear of what would happen next, the loss of his job, his reputation, his entire life, silenced the words before they could form. "No, Captain," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Everything's in the report." Reynolds nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "All right. Keep your head down for the next few days. The press is already sniffing around, and you don't want to give them any reason to dig deeper." Ryan swallowed, a heavy weight settling in his chest. "Understood." As Ryan left the office, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He knew that the investigation would bring scrutiny, but there was something else gnawing at him, something far deeper than the fear of being caught. It was the guilt. The guilt that clung to him like a shadow, growing larger with each passing hour. While Ryan wrestled with his guilt, Ava's family was reeling from the shock of her death. At the Thompson household, grief hung in the air like a heavy fog. Ava's mother, Gloria, sat on the living room couch, her hands trembling as she held a photo of her daughter, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. Ava's son, Darren, stood by the window, staring out at the street as though expecting his mother to walk through the door at any moment. They had gotten the call early that morning. Gloria had been the one to answer, her heart sinking the moment she heard the voice on the other end. Ava was dead, shot by a police officer during a routine traffic stop. The words felt unreal, like some terrible dream that she couldn't wake up from. Darren clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He was 17, old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened, but too young to know how to cope with it. His mother had been everything to him. She had worked tirelessly to provide for him, always reminding him to be careful around the police, to keep his head down, to avoid trouble. And now she was gone, taken from him by the very system she had warned him about. The news of Ava's death spread quickly through their community. Friends and neighbors gathered outside the Thompson home, offering condolences, but their presence only seemed to amplify the loss. Gloria couldn't bring herself to speak to anyone. The pain was too raw, too consuming. Darren, on the other hand, felt something else simmering beneath the grief, anger. He didn't know the details of what had happened, but he didn't need to. A black woman had been killed by a white cop, and to him, the story was as old as time itself. He vowed to find out the truth, to make sure his mother's name wasn't forgotten in the shuffle of legal proceedings and media narratives. Days passed, and the internal investigation into Ava Thompson's death began in earnest. The department's Internal Affairs Division started reviewing the body camera footage, witness statements, and Ryan's report. The protests that had been brewing in town over the incident intensified, drawing more attention from the media. The footage from Ryan's body camera was damning. It showed the entire encounter. The escalation, the shouting, the moment when Ryan drew his weapon. Though it didn't clearly show what Ava was doing in the seconds before the shot, the narrative that Ryan had painted in his report was starting to fall apart under scrutiny. Ryan knew that the investigation was turning against him. The local journalist, Sarah Caldwell, had written several damning articles in the town paper, questioning the official narrative and suggesting that racial bias had played a role in the shooting. The protesters outside the station carried signs with Ava's name, demanding justice, their chants echoing through the small town streets. Ryan sat in his patrol car during his lunch break, staring out at the crowd of protesters. He could feel their hatred directed at him, even though they didn't know his name yet. Soon enough, they would. The media would make sure of that. His phone buzzed. It was another text from Sergeant Davis. "They're going to bring you in for questioning. You need to stay calm. Don't let them see any cracks." But the cracks were already forming. That night, after another long shift at the station, Ryan returned home to find the house dark. Melissa was staying with her sister for the week, giving them both some space. Ryan welcomed the solitude, though the emptiness of the house only amplified his sense of isolation. He poured himself another drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring into the amber liquid. His mind drifted back to the investigation, the press, the protesters. He could feel the walls closing in, and the thought of losing everything, his career, his family, his freedom, gnawed at him. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he walked to the window. Outside, the night was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The hallucinations had started again, more vivid this time. He had seen Ava's face reflected in the window earlier, her eyes accusing him, her voice echoing in his mind. "What do you want from me?" he muttered, running his hands through his hair. The image of Ava wouldn't leave him. She was everywhere. In his dreams, in the corners of his vision, in the dead silence of his home. He couldn't escape her. He couldn't escape what he had done. And the worst part was, deep down, he knew he didn't deserve to. The following day, Ryan was called in for an official interview with the internal affairs officers. The interrogation room was sterile, cold, the kind of place designed to make people squirm. Ryan sat across from Detective Marquez, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for getting to the truth. The questions came one after the other, each one chipping away at the defense Ryan had built around himself. "Why did you draw your weapon so quickly?" Marquez asked, his tone neutral but piercing. "She was resisting," Ryan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But the footage doesn't show her making any sudden movements," Marquez countered. "Why did you feel threatened?" Ryan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "I did what I had to do," he said through gritted teeth. Marquez didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at Ryan, waiting for the cracks to widen. The pressure was mounting. Every question felt like a weight pressing down on him, every answer a battle to keep his composure. But the guilt was there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to spill out at any moment. As the interrogation continued, Ryan could feel the walls of his carefully constructed narrative crumbling. He had justified his actions to himself 1,000 times, but now, under the scrutiny of someone who wasn't willing to accept his excuses, the truth became harder to deny. He had killed Ava Thompson out of fear that had been fueled by years of bias, by an instinctive distrust of someone who didn't look like him. And now, he was paying the price. The investigation was far from over, but Ryan knew, deep down, that it wouldn't end in his favor. And the worst part was, he didn't deserve for it to. The next few days passed in a blur for Ryan Pierce. Every time he walked into the police station, he felt like he was being watched, scrutinized. Conversations that used to flow naturally with his fellow officers now felt forced, stilted. Even his once supportive colleagues seemed distant, as if they were unsure whether to keep their distance or show solidarity. The investigation into Ava's death had gained national attention, with major news outlets picking up the story, and the weight of public scrutiny bore down on him like a vice. Ryan's mind was unraveling. The hallucinations that had begun as fleeting images of Ava now became full-fledged encounters. He'd see her at night, sitting across from him at the dinner table, her face pale and drained of life. When he blinked, she'd disappear, but her presence lingered, a constant reminder of what he had done. Part 5. The Mental Collapse, 5,000 Words. The next few days passed in a blur for Ryan Pierce. Every time he walked into the police station, he felt like he was being watched, scrutinized. Conversations that used to flow naturally with his fellow officers now felt forced, stilted. Even his once supportive colleagues seemed distant, as if they were unsure whether to keep their distance or show solidarity. The investigation into Ava's death had gained national attention, with major news outlets picking up the story, and the weight of public scrutiny bore down on him like a vice. Ryan's mind was unraveling. The hallucinations that had begun as fleeting images of Ava now became full-fledged encounters. He'd see her at night, sitting across from him at the dinner table, her face pale and drained of life. When he blinked, she'd disappear, but her presence lingered, a constant reminder of what he had done. He had stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, her body lying lifeless on the ground, her eyes wide with terror, her voice still echoing in his mind. He could hear her calling his name, accusing him, haunting him. At work, he was distracted. During a routine patrol, Ryan nearly ran a red light. His partner, Officer Tomlinson, shot him a concerned glance but said nothing. They both knew what was happening. Everyone knew. But no one dared confront it. One night, after another restless day, Ryan returned home to find his house in disarray. Melissa had come back, but she was packing her things, throwing clothes and personal items into suitcases with a sense of finality. Ryan stood in the doorway, too exhausted and numb to respond. She didn't look up as she packed, her movements quick and efficient. "I'm leaving," she said flatly, her voice void of emotion. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had expected this, but the reality of it still hit him like a punch to the gut. Melissa paused for a moment, her hands gripping the handle of the suitcase. She finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with something that resembled pity. "I can't do this anymore, Ryan. I can't sit here and pretend that everything's fine, that you're fine. You're not." Ryan clenched his fists, trying to keep control. "Melissa, I'm under a lot of stress. The investigation." "This isn't about the investigation," she interrupted, her voice rising. "It's about you. You're not the same person anymore. You're not even trying to be." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt something break inside him. The anger, the guilt, the fear, it all came crashing down on him, and he felt himself crumbling under the weight of it all. "You don't understand what it's like," he said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Melissa shot back, her eyes blazing with anger. "You didn't mean to kill her? Or you didn't mean to let it get this far?" Ryan said nothing, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't find the words to express the storm raging inside him. Melissa shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ryan, but I can't be here anymore. I can't watch you destroy yourself." With that, she zipped up her suitcase and left without another word, leaving Ryan standing alone in the empty house. As the investigation dragged on, the protests outside the police station grew larger and more intense. What had begun as peaceful demonstrations had escalated into full-scale confrontations between protesters and law enforcement. Signs bearing Ava's name were held high, and her face became a symbol of the injustice that so many in the black community had experienced. Darren Thompson, Ava's son, had become one of the faces of the movement. His quiet, yet powerful speeches at rallies had garnered attention, not only from local activists but from national organizations pushing for police reform. Darren's grief was palpable, and his determination to seek justice for his mother's death was unwavering. "Her name is Ava Thompson," he said during one rally, his voice steady despite the emotion choking his throat. "She was a mother, a daughter, a human being. And she was taken from us by someone who swore to protect and serve. But she was never a threat. She was never armed. And yet she's gone." Ryan watched these rallies on the news, feeling his stomach churn with a mix of guilt and bitterness. Darren's words echoed in his mind, making it harder to maintain the walls he had built to protect himself from the truth. Each time Darren spoke, it felt like another crack forming in Ryan's already fragile psyche. He could no longer escape what he had done. It was everywhere he turned. One cold evening, Ryan found himself sitting in his patrol car after his shift had ended, staring blankly at the dashboard. The internal investigation had reached a critical point, and he knew he was one step away from losing everything. The pressure was unbearable. Unable to face the thought of going home to an empty house, Ryan decided to drive. He didn't know where he was going or why. He just needed to move, to get away from everything. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He pulled out of the station's parking lot and drove through the quiet streets of Greenfield, Wisconsin, the town illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights. As he drove, Ryan's mind began to wander. His thoughts drifted to the past, his childhood, his early years as a cop, the slow and steady rise of his career. He had once been proud of who he was, proud of the uniform he wore, the authority it gave him. But now, it all felt hollow, meaningless. The guilt weighed on him like a heavy stone, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. The hallucinations had become more frequent, more vivid. Ava's voice whispered in his ear, telling him that he couldn't escape what he had done. Her face appeared in the rearview mirror, her eyes accusing, her lips moving, though he couldn't hear the words. Ryan clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I didn't mean to," he whispered to no one. "I didn't mean to." But Ava's image remained, unyielding. His mind spiraled, the road ahead becoming a blur. The world outside the car felt distant, as though it was slipping away from him. The guilt, the fear, the shame, it was all too much. As he turned onto Maple Street, something inside him snapped. His vision blurred, his head swimming with a mix of alcohol and exhaustion. His foot pressed down on the gas pedal harder, the car accelerating. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't live with what he had done. The darkness inside him was too deep, too suffocating. He didn't see the tree until it was too late. The car swerved violently as he tried to regain control, but the wheels skidded on the icy road. The last thing Ryan saw before the world went black was the large oak tree looming in front of him, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The impact was sudden, violent. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the world around Ryan Pierce disappeared. The news of Ryan Pierce's death spread quickly through the town of Greenfield. The local media reported the car accident as a tragic ending to a tumultuous career. Some speculated that it had been an accident caused by icy roads, while others whispered about the possibility of something darker, suicide. For the protesters outside the station, Ryan's death was met with a mix of emotions. Some saw it as a kind of twisted justice, a man who had taken a life now losing his own. Others viewed it as a tragedy, a man consumed by the weight of his guilt, unable to cope with the consequences of his actions. At the Thompson household, Darren and Gloria received the news with quiet, somber reflection. Gloria sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring out the window as if lost in thought. Darren stood by the door, his face unreadable. "He's dead," Darren said softly, breaking the silence. Gloria nodded, her eyes never leaving the window. "It won't bring her back," she murmured. "It won't change what happened." Darren's jaw clenched. "No, it won't. But maybe now, there's some closure. Maybe now we can move on." But even as he said the words, Darren wasn't sure if they were true. Ava's death had left a wound in their lives that couldn't be healed by Ryan's demise. The pain, the injustice, it was still there, festering beneath the surface. The town of Greenfield would never be the same. Ava's name had become a symbol of the fight against racial injustice, her story a rallying cry for those who demanded change. But now, with Ryan's death, the narrative took on a new, tragic dimension. Ryan's funeral was sparsely attended. His fellow officers were there, along with a handful of townspeople who still believed in the man they thought they knew. But most of the town stayed away, unsure of how to feel about the man who had been both a protector and a perpetrator. As Darren stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching the small group gather around Ryan's grave, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. He had lost his mother to violence, and now, the man responsible for her death was gone too. But even with Ryan's death, the fight for justice was far from over. The system that had allowed Ava's death to happen still existed. The biases, the prejudices, the institutional failures, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface. Darren knew that the road ahead would be long, but he was determined to keep walking it. As the last of the mourners left the cemetery, Darren made his way to the oak tree on Maple Street where Ryan had crashed. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the twisted metal remnants of the accident, the bark of the tree scarred from the impact. For the first time since his mother's death, Darren felt a flicker of peace. Not because justice had been served, but because the man who had taken so much from him was now gone. There would be no more lies, no more excuses. Just silence. And in that silence, Darren vowed to continue the fight his mother had begun, to seek justice not just for her, but for all the others who had been silenced by men like Ryan Pierce.